today, Dr. Bagby's out of town, so she asked me to give a lecture, and at the beginning of the course she asked what I wanted to talk about. And so I thought we could do some transition lectures, because we're going from Plato, who, Socrates died in 399 BC, all the way to Machiavelli, who is in 1400 AD, 1500. So we're covering about 2,000-year gap that we're not doing any political thought for. So I thought this might be informative for you. There are going to be some questions from this on the exam, but it's going to be really obvious stuff since Dr. Bagby's going to ask me to write the questions. So I'm not going to throw out anything very obscure. So if you pay attention and take a few notes on the major things, you should be all right. Okay, well. Today I'm going to go over kind of how political thought progressed, especially how Plato's thought progressed, how Plato was adapted by people that came after him, and especially the Christian philosophers, and how that turned into the political philosophy that Machiavelli was challenging. I'll also just go in depth to some medieval political thought, kind of how political ideas were interpreted. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion on the church, on history. So this will hopefully there's a lot more history than political thought in this, I think. But hopefully it's informative for you. And feel free to interrupt me with questions anytime. And hopefully I can get through it and I'm not too long-winded today. So. Okay, we're going to talk with the spread of Platonic thought and the spread of Plato's thought. We know Socrates died in 399 BC, and after he died, his most famous pupil, who was Plato, continued Socrates' tradition by founding a school called the Academy in Athens. And the Academy in Athens survived for a very long time. It was a very famous school. And Plato's most famous pupil was Aristotle. We'll talk about Aristotle in a bit. But immediately following Socrates' death, Platonic thought stayed strong through the tradition of the Academy, through the tradition of Plato's other students. So even when Plato died, in Athens and the surrounding areas in Greece, there was still a good nucleus of Plato's thought. It survived throughout the era. And there's a famous scene from the mural, this called The School in Athens, by Raffaello Sanzio. I tried to include artwork, so in case I run out of things to talk about, I can point to the pictures. So, okay. Now, Aristotle here, if you ever get a chance to read Aristotle, there's a lot to read, but I would encourage you to look into it. He was probably one of the most versatile minds of his day. Again, he was Plato's most famous student. And he wrote on a many variety of topics, on biology and medicine and physics and metaphysics and ethics and political thought. He wrote on everything. He could probably be counted as the most influential thinker in history just with the breadth of what he wrote on. For the next couple thousand years, people were still writing about Aristotle and what he had done. And this is important. He wasn't an exact copy of Plato. His political thought was very distinct from Plato's thought. What he did was, as you know from reading Plato, he's a little kind of hard to read. It's kind of hard to penetrate the ideas beneath him. He has this very sort of theoretical structure of what the truth is and what knowledge is. And Aristotle sort of brings that down to our level so we can understand it. He still maintains the tradition in political thought that human beings can be improved through good laws, but he didn't necessarily put as many restrictions on it as Plato. Plato demands a whole lot from human nature. Aristotle doesn't demand as much. Now, where Aristotle becomes important in terms of how Plato's thought advances, that he became, in 343 BC, the tutor of a young prince of Macedon named Alexander. And of course, if you saw that Oliver Stone movie, I'm sorry for you, A, and B, how that thing was horrible. Angelina Jolie's accent had me in fits the whole movie. But as you can see, Macedonia here is where Aristotle went. It's in northern Greece. And by this time, we know Athens had been defeated in the Peloponnesian War. Sparta had been defeated by a city-state called Thebes, by a famous general who went down there and freed their slave population. So southern Greece was kind of falling apart, and northern Greece here, Macedonia, was really becoming ascendant. And eventually Philip II, who was Alexander the Great's father, conquers the rest of Greece. But what's important is that Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. He would have known about Platonic thought, and not only that, but his generals, many of his childhood friends, were also tutored by Aristotle. Now that doesn't mean they grew up to be political philosophers and they, wanted to contribute to Platonic thought or anything like that, but it means they would have been schooled in it. And more importantly, it means that the aristocracy of Macedonia would have known about ancient thought. To know about Plato would be a sign of learning. Anyone who wanted to get anywhere would have to have read Plato and Aristotle. And this becomes really important considering exactly how much of the world Alexander the Great conquered. Now, Greek philosophy, especially Platonic thought, went from Greece to Egypt. Knowledge of Plato was a sign of learning, as I've said up there. And for the next several centuries, the Mediterranean world would become called the Hellenistic world. Hellene was a term the Greeks called themselves. It basically means Greek, but all the Greeks called themselves Hellenes. And so it was a Hellenistic world dominated by Greek thinking and culture. And you can see here's a map kind of what the Hellenistic world consisted of. You have over here Macedonia, and Thrace, where Alexander was from, and of course he conquers all the way through Asia Minor and all the way toward modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course down to Egypt. So all of this area gets exposed to Greek culture. Do you have a question? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Just let me know when everyone's got it. So. Any questions thus far? Yeah.
So, all this happened in the era of this Hellenistic world.
What's that?
I think this regular Greek philosophy. All this happened in the Hellenistic world.
Yes. And that would be, I have the dates on the next page, but basically it's from the conquest of Alexander the Great and the spread of Alexander to when the Romans take over the Mediterranean world. So it's called the Hellenistic world. And does everyone have this? Good. I'll see if Dr. Bagby wants to put this PowerPoint online. I might just ask her to. But I don't know if she will or not. So you can see that Greek thought and culture, including a knowledge of Plato, spreads all the way to the Indus River, your modern day Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran. Yeah.
Like you said, Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great. Did he travel with him, or did he tutored and Alexander went off and conquered?
I'm not sure. I don't think he followed him. I don't think he really would have approved of what Alexander the Great did. Aside from being a conqueror, he was a great mass murderer and slaughter cities that he took over and things like that. It's kind of a part of Alexander the Great you don't hear about. Everyone concentrates on he was a hero and he did all this so young. But it's important to note throughout this time, for the next several hundred years, Greek culture is ascendant. For instance, you all know Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra in Egypt during the Roman times. Well, Cleopatra isn't necessarily a Egyptian name; it's a Greek name. And her family were from the Ptolemies, who were part of Alexander the Great's generals. And for instance, Ptolemy himself was tutored by Aristotle. And all through this, hopefully you can understand that for much of this area was Greek in nature. It's not kind of how we see it today, especially Turkey. Greeks lived in modern-day Turkey more than any other ethnic group. But again, you can see this spread, and how that expands where Plato's thought is and where it comes from. Okay. Now, as I said, following Alexander's conquests, of the entire known world to them, and his empire split into several parts, into different kingdoms, and it survived for a couple of hundred years. But then the Romans took over, and the Romans were different from the Greeks in that they didn't have kind of an intellectual tradition like the Greeks did. If you think of the Spartans, and as opposed to the Athenians, well, the Romans were probably more Spartan. They were very martial in nature. They liked conquest. Their main intellectual feats were in science and engineering, not in the higher realm of philosophy. And if we remember, the Romans, aside from having very little of their own philosophy, their own political philosophy, they also adapted the Greek religion. There are Roman names for the Greek gods, etc. About the only Roman political philosopher of note was named Cicero. He was a famous politician. If you ever have to take a Latin class, you have to read a bunch of his speeches. And his primary contribution to political thought was to take the ideas of Plato and kind of translate them into Latin and add kind of a Roman Stoic spin on them. And so basically Roman political thought was Greek in nature. But again, it wasn't as big an influence for the Romans as it was for the Greeks. Now this shows the empire kind of later on, where you have it split into East and West. And we'll get to the importance of this, the East being where Constantinople was and West being where Rome was. So keep that in mind, because I will talk a little bit about the differences later on between the East and the West. And the culture that we're talking about in Machiavelli would have been influenced more by the West. But just keep that in mind. So does everyone have that? And so, even hundreds of years after Plato's death, we see his thought continuing to have more of an influence as the Romans conquered the world. They expanded from Egypt to Spain, and from England down to England over to the Euphrates River. So, the Romans were able, through their adoption of Greek thought, kept Plato's thought alive. So this is kind of a long history of conquest in which this kind of this thought of this one guy in Athens sort of spreads throughout the whole known world. So it's kind of an interesting idea, but you can see why Plato, who lived in Athens and died thousands of years ago, is still important to us today, because his thought had such a profound influence on those who came after him, and it spread throughout where most of our intellectual tradition comes from. So, now, the big change that we see in Platonic philosophy and Platonic thought comes roughly in 300 AD, 400 AD, when the Roman Emperor Constantine announced his toleration for Christianity. Now, at the beginning of the lecture, I had up there the Raphael's painting, the vision of the cross, or the Battle of the Mulvian Bridge, which shows the Emperor Constantine seeing the cross in the sky, and he apparently was told, by this sign you will conquer, and he eventually ends up converting to Christianity. So the old pagan religion of the Greeks and Romans gradually kind of leaves the forefront, and Christian ideas, which were several hundred years old by now, become ascendant. Okay, now Plato and early Christian thought sort of had a good deal in common. Or not a good deal in common, I should say, but the early Christians didn't shy away from philosophy. If you think about that map I showed earlier of the Hellenistic world, you can see where Judea is and whereabouts Jerusalem is. And many people who would have been converted early on to Christianity were Greeks, or at least Greek-educated Jews or Aramaeans or other ethnic groups. The original work of the New Testament was written in a type of Greek called Koine. And so those who would be most attracted, I would say, toward Christian thought early on in the teachings of Christ would have been these educated people who had a knowledge of Plato's thought and Plato's philosophy. And I'd say the best example of that is probably St. Paul the Apostle. If you have an idea of what Plato's philosophy is and you read the epistles of St. Paul, you can come to an understanding where, well, this is a guy who knows his Plato. I mean, he kind of writes, he has a lot of influences. We'll go into those a little further on. But again, because of the expansion of Platonic thought throughout the world, and then where Christianity sprung up and where it spread, especially in Greece and Rome, or Greece and the Roman Empire, you can see why, or how Platonic thought got adopted into the Christian ideas. Okay. So, now, why were the Christians attracted to Platonic thought? Well, as we said earlier, unlike many other religions, the Christians were more than happy to adopt philosophy. It wasn't this competition between faith and reason that we kind of see today, but the Christians were more than willing to take on Plato to help strengthen their position, to help expand and to help proselytize other people. So, as we can see, and as we noted, Plato believes in absolute truths. He believes in an absolute truth. He believes that perfection exists for humanity, and that through reason we can observe this truth and hopefully realize it. So, Plato, you didn't get too much of this in the Gorgias, but in the Republic and in other works, Plato kind of elucidates this theory that he believes that there is a perfect level in which like perfection exists. And so the second bullet point, justice, morality, everything kind of had a true form that mankind could understand. Now, I don't know if she had you read in her book the section of the myth at the end of the Republic, but I'll go into that. At the end of the Republic, Plato tells the people who are gathered with him this myth that he has. And in it, all of humanity is depicted as living in a cave. And we're facing the wall of the cave, and we're all tied up. And there's a fire in the cave, and everything we see is shadows bouncing off the wall from the fire. And there are people, waving images and things like that. And so all we see is shadows, artificial shadows. That's what our existence is. Now, one day, one of the prisoners, or the people who's tied up watching the wall, escapes, gets them out of the caves and sees the sun. And the sun is the real light. It's the real truth. And that person is a philosopher. And he goes back to try and tell his friends, hey, come out, I saw the sun, I've seen the real light, not just this fake shadows dancing on the wall reality that you guys exist, and they don't want to go with it. And so the philosopher is someone who escapes the artificial world, the shadows on the wall, and sees the truth, sees this higher plane. And that's kind of a very abstract idea. But you can see how the early Christians would say, well, Plato talks about going out and seeing the sun. What he's really seeing is the truths elucidated by God, the truths that God has set out. Plato also elucidates talks about the immortality of the soul. He presents a strict moral teaching. I think, as Dr. Bagby wrote in her early in the preface to Idealism in her book, probably the most people in modern day who are most like Plato's idealists would be Christian moralists and conservatives of that nature who try to present a strict moral code to try and improve the character of people. To go back to this idea of absolute truths, that kind of takes a little bit to get your mind around, but it's really important for ancient thought. If you think back to geometry in high school, or if you've taken it in college, I don't know if they offer elementary geometry, but you think about drawing a circle and or drawing a line. And no matter what you put down on paper, it's never going to be perfect. You can use a perfect compass or anything like that. It's not going to reflect a perfect circle, because a perfect circle is infinite points a line doesn't have any endpoints. You can't draw an infinite line. So, these ideas in geometry, they're theoretical, but they work for us. I mean, we can kind of understand them. We know that they exist in theory, but it's hard for us to replicate that in practice. I mean, we can't draw an infinite line with no endpoints. We can't draw a perfect circle. And Plato was familiar with Pythagoras and with ideas of geometry too. And just as there is a perfect circle or a perfect line in geometry, so too is there a perfect justice or a perfect morality. So, and Plato thinks that as long as you understand, as long as you reason enough and you study enough, you can, just like you can understand the perfect circle, you can understand the perfect morality or the perfect justice. So does that make sense to everyone? I hope it does. I never liked geometry much anyway. But Plato, actually in the Republic, he hypothesizes a city that is ruled by philosopher kings. And he kind of goes into how this philosopher king should be educated. And it's all this, 20 years in mathematics, 10 years in poetry and music, and then more mathematics and all this. You kind of wonder, what's the point? I think he was just playing a joke on us. But anyway, so hopefully you can get your mind behind absolute truth. So it was easy for the early Christian thinkers to say, hey, Plato gets the idea. He knows that there's this higher plane that truth exists on, but he thought you could get there by reason. You can't. The only way you can understand perfection, the only way you can understand truth, the real truth, is with the help of faith. Unassisted reason is not enough. Plato was on the right track, but he didn't have faith in Jesus. He wasn't exposed to the teachings of Jesus Christ. And Plato, go ahead.
Well, isn't the whole thing with philosophy is the love of knowledge, and the whole thing was coming out of the myths. So it's a turn the philosophy in Greece was without it, and now they're going back to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. If you recall, Plato was dismissive of religion in Athens. He would use myths. He would incorporate myths, but he often discounted the teachings of traditional religion, as we say, kind of eschewed tradition, unlike Confucius. But what the early Christian thinkers do, they take Plato's thought and adapt faith back into it. And they say, Plato was so impractical anyway, and expected so much of human nature, that he had to be mistaken. And so, for instance, Plato is considered one of the virtuous pagans. If you read, say, Dante's Inferno, in the first circle, or before he descends into hell, is where the virtuous pagans live, and you have people like Caesar and Cicero and Ovid and Plato or Socrates, and and Virgil is the guide throughout the Roman poet who was thought to have predicted the birth of Christ in one of his poems, is actually the guide in the Inferno. So this Christian tradition of the virtuous pagan kind of it adopts Socratic thought to itself. Let's see. This sets up something for some reason I forgot to put it down on here, but you might want to write it down. I don't know if I'll ask a question on it, but this presents a dilemma in political thought that we still discuss today. This question of unassisted reason versus Christian faith. And it's called the dilemma of Athens versus Jerusalem. So as you can understand, the tradition of philosophy coming from Athens is, believes that unassisted reason is enough to know the truth or truths. And the Jerusalem tradition is where you know truth through faith and through revelation. That is something revealed by God. So if you write Athens versus Jerusalem, or the dilemma between Athens and Jerusalem, that's what that means. It's faith versus reason. Now, it's not particularly accurate because the Christians still believed in using reason. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, some of the great Christian thinkers and theologians believed that you had to use reason. Yes?
I thought it was told that the ancient Roman gospel, from Greek to kind of Jews, they really didn't. They just combined their paganism with Christianity, but they had a hard time with people. Over time, all they knew was Greek views and all that. So they put them together with the, as an example, Easter.
Yeah.
It wasn't really got nothing to do with it, you feel?
Oh yeah, that's true.
Christmas with the Yule log. Those are like, they go back to the way the paganism. They just put it together because they had a hard time converting the Greek.
Yeah. As you can see, that's perfectly correct, because the people who were kind of easily converted to Christianity would have been those who had a basis in philosophy. But when it came to recruiting kind of common people, they had to, and especially the barbarians in Europe and things like that, who kind of had a pagan religion, the early Christians had to adopt things. It's why we celebrate Christmas on December the 25th, or why we celebrate Easter, or All Souls Day is a celebration of the harvest. So a lot of these old pagan traditions came down and were incorporated into the Christian tradition. So the history of that's really unique and really interesting. But that's more kind of the outward celebration. I think the inward, most of these questions of Plato and Christian thought would have been discussed by priests and bishops and monks and people who were already engaged, already kind of knew what they were about as far as political thought's concerned. So does everyone kind of have that? Is there any other question or any questions about that? Thanks for bringing that up, by the way. All right. Now, what I kind of thought of as a good example of how Christian thought was integrated into, or how Platonic thought was integrated into Christianity, is this question of what is called concupiscence. If anyone's taken a humanities course here at K-State, I know they used to teach, I think it was the Introduction to Humanities, they kind of discussed this problem. But concupiscence is basically, it's a word that means lust or desire, in kind of a physical fashion. And it asks the question, why does man desire worldly things? Why do we lust after, the temporal, pleasures of the flesh or food and wine, things like that? Why are human beings who are modeled in God's image and created by an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God, why does he allow this evil in the world? Why does he allow human beings to be so fundamentally flawed? And you should see kind of when we talked with Plato, and he talked about the tyrannical soul that was ruled by his appetites. That plays very much into this, especially on the next slide I'll show you. And this was pretty much mainly formulated by a fellow named St. Augustine, who we'll also get to in a couple of slides. St. Augustine of Hippo, or St. Augustine, however you want to pronounce it. And basically this problem says that in Eden, because they took the Bible to be the literal, Word of God, all these events actually happened. But in the Garden of Eden, man had a connection with God. He was created by God. He had his connection. His soul was correctly ordered. But his original sin snapped or severed that connection. We were no longer in tune with God's will and God's reason. And so the soul of man was corrupted. Now, the early church fathers used Plato's conception of the soul, which we studied in the Gorgias, to formulate the solution to this problem, or to explain this. And I included up here from John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is basically a poem kind of expressing that. I would encourage everyone to look at that. Paradise Lost is kind of a neat book. I think they actually teach a whole course on that one poem, or at least on John Milton. So, does everyone have this? All right. Now, here we have these kind of two states. One is man soul before the fall, or that is before the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, before original sin, and then man's soul after the Garden of Eden. And this is how the early Christians used Plato's thought. Remember what Plato said about the right-ordered soul and the tyrannical soul. And the right-ordered soul was governed by reason. And its willpower was subordinate to that reason. And finally, the worldly appetites were on the bottom. He wasn't a slave to his passions, as, say, Callicles was. And so with this, here, man's link with God, it was man's connection with God, according to the Christians, that allowed his soul to be ruled by reason. And reason here is interpreted as a reflection of God's will, a reflection of God's natural law. So they incorporate reason and faith like this. Okay. Now after the fall, after our severed connection, what happens is the soul becomes disordered. And our appetites govern the will, and our reason is on bottom. It's on the bottom. And the willpower just means your will to action, your what you do, etc. It's kind of Plato goes into this, especially in the Republic. But remember that someone who's always governed by their passions is a leaky jar. They're a slave to their desires. They're never fulfilled. But someone who's governed by reason is happy to be where he is. He can control his passions. He controls his life. So this is Callicles' man, and that is Plato's man. And Plato refers to this as the tyrannical soul, governed by his appetites, etc. So hopefully this kind of explains that. I'm skipping a lot over in the vast question of concupiscence, which comprised a great deal of Christian thinking, and this is kind of a bare bones explanation, but you see how they would have incorporated. When they needed to come up with an idea of the soul, they said, well, this Plato fella has a really good idea over here, and we kind of all know about it, so why don't we just take that? It obviously kind of fits him. But the thing is with reason in this case is not just self-control and knowledge, it's tied into faith, it's tied into God. And thus, I probably could have put this later, but governments and civil societies exist to regulate man's evil nature. And for Augustine, who we'll talk about in a little bit, this is an expression that earthly governments exist to keep man kind of in line, not necessarily to improve him, as earthly governments are able to do that, but to keep him from committing too much evil to others. So this is a result of original sin. This is kind of what original sin refers to. It's man's original sin, which snapped the connection with God in the Garden of Eden. So, does everyone have this? Okay, we're going to get into some kind of early Christian political thought, and this is St. Augustine of Hippo. Hippo is in Africa, and he was, as we say, born in modern-day Algeria, which was then part of Rome's Africa province. And this was at the very end of the Roman Empire. He lived from, as you see these days, lived a long time. And he was probably the most influential Christian, or as we'd say Catholic now, theologian. And he incorporated a great deal of Plato into the church doctrine. I'd say probably for 800 years, until St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine was the most important thinker in the Catholic Church, and his doctrines and the sheer breadth of things he wrote on influenced Christian dogma and Catholic dogma to this day. He's the one who formulated, in large part, this idea of concupiscence that we just talked about. He came up with ideas of grace and how man, or Catholic salvation, how man is saved and how he can go to heaven, etc. And his famous work on politics was called De Civitate Dei, or the City of God. And we'll discuss that in a little deeper detail. But yeah, he was educated in the city of Carthage. And so, as we said, from Africa, lived most of his life in North Africa. And as we'd say, and again, very, very influential. Does everyone have that? Now here's some expressions, just kind of briefly, of some of Augustine's political thought before we go into the City of God. That shouldn't say impractical, it should probably say mistaken, but I write, for Augustine, Plato and the other idealists were impractical. They were mistaken, not because they demanded too much of human nature, but because they didn't know the true remedy for man's weakness. Man's congenital weakness was not necessarily in his nature, for the remedy of it was Christian faith. So whereas Plato demands so much of human beings to govern all their passions and live moderately and to engage in heavy philosophizing if you want to be a true happy person, Augustine says to know the truth and to be kind of Plato's ideal soul, you need Christian faith. It's not necessarily, the cures for human nature, as we say, the cures for the weaknesses in human nature are embodied there for Augustine. Now, this is the second point up here is very important for the continuation, or very important down through Christian thought, and it's a very important idea still today. Augustine distinguished between what he called the eternal law and the temporal law. And if we think of temporal, it just means earthly. It means temporary, it's on this earth. It's law that man creates. The eternal law was based on God's will. It followed reason. It was perfect. And there were certain eternal laws that were enumerated in Revelation and through the saints, etc. The temporal law was based on man's reason. And so we have these kind of two levels of law. The eternal law formulated by God, and the temporal law, which is formulated by man. And the best situation is when the temporal law by man reflects the eternal laws of God. So you see, this eternal law can kind of take the place of Plato's absolute truths, his absolute justice and morality. And the temporal law is kind of the bastardization we make of that here on earth because we're sinful or immoral. Now this is the source, or one of the sources, for what we call in political thought natural law tradition. And natural law tradition has a very long timeline, and it was again encompassed by St. Thomas Aquinas later on. If you look back even to Plato and Aristotle, they talk a lot about the natural, what is natural. The real world should reflect the natural world. Even Callicles makes that argument, that the real world should reflect what is natural, and that is that the strong should rule the weak. And natural law, this idea that there are fundamental laws on a higher plane that we need to obey, it comes all the way down to even Martin Luther King, who wrote the letter to a Birmingham jail. It sounds a lot like letter from a Birmingham jail sounds a lot like St. Thomas Aquinas, in which he talks about higher laws that are more important than the unjust laws of segregation and so on created by man. Yeah.
Martin Luther King is a villain. There's no way when people are kicking and scratching, you can tell them no about it. You gotta fight fire with fire. That kid has no sense.
Well, I'm not going to debate his tactics, but I'm telling you where he got his motivation to resist from, or his motivation to do what he did from. It's because he believes that the laws of man are unjust and that there are higher laws above them that we should obey. And among those are the equality of all human beings, etc. Now if we say, and this, again, it continues down that there are higher laws that are more important than temporal law. Now we're going to talk about how these are formulated, but hopefully this makes sense to you. Oops. Now, in The City of God, the book De Civitate Dei, Augustine was writing shortly after the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD. Rome had been the greatest power on earth for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it had weakened, especially in the West. And remember I showed you the division of the Roman Empire between the East and the West. Well, in the West it was falling apart. And in the East it stayed strong for another 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire wasn't taken down finally until the fall of Constantinople by the Turks. I think it was in the 1400s. I should know that. I can't remember the exact date. But suffice it to say that the western part of the empire, the part in which Augustine lived, was breaking down. And in this time, when everything was going to pot, when these huge, symbols of order were falling apart, when the Roman emperor was being killed, etc., Augustine was trying to encourage his readers, because it really looked like governments were in disarray, that we were all going to be thrown to the mercy of God, that the barbarians were going to come in and kill us all. And they did invade all over Greece. There were barbarians that made it to Africa, and barbarians that made it to Sicily and southern Italy, etc. So they really did all live in danger during these barbarian invasions. Now, this was before the barbarians were successfully converted to Christianity and kind of brought into the fold, and before the Eastern European or the Western European kingdoms. Okay. Well, in this book, Augustine argues that there are essentially two cities, and he's not referring to city as we think of it, but more like civil societies or governments, or however you want to say, ways of life. There's a city of God on the one hand, and the city of man on the other hand. And the city of God is composed of those pious individuals who serve God. It exists here, and it's composed of people who are working for the greater glory of God, who are searching for the truth in the eternal law, who are trying to break beyond, become one with God. It is governed by this eternal law, or it should be anyway. It's not necessarily the church. This is really important. The city of God doesn't mean the structure of the church. It's all pious people. And Augustine sometimes refers to it as a church, but it's not necessarily. It exists on earth. It's a community of men who subordinate themselves to God. And the thing is, the city of God in its perfect state is in the afterlife. So while you have people who serve God, and you have the city of God that exists as community, it actually, its perfect state is in the afterlife, because in the afterlife God truly does rule directly. It's the New Jerusalem, as they called it. And so the idea was to turn your attention to life after this. And here we see kind of the city of God is enclosed in its battlements, and the devils and demons are running around it, but they're kept out by the law. And these devils mean earthly temptations and things like that, etc. But you have these pious people who are serving God inside the city, etc. This is kind of hard to get your head around, so I'll work a little more with this, or I'll discuss a little more with this. But does everyone have this slide? No? Okay. Now, when Plato in the Republic discussed his ideal city, it existed only in Plato's mind. It's called the city in speech. And it's really weird. But this is different in that the city of God actually kind of exists on earth. But it's not necessarily a tangible thing. It's hard to get your head around here. I was reviewing last night my notes on this to try and see if I can make it more easy to understand, and I really couldn't. So, okay, everyone should have that. All right. Now, different from the city of God is the city of man. And the city of man is all the nations and governments and civil societies that we engage ourselves in. So on the one hand, you have the city, or a community, serving God's interests and subordinating itself to God. On the other hand, you have a group or community subordinating itself to the needs of man. It serves the interests and needs of man, not God. So it's often termed the heavenly city and the earthly city. You think of the heavenly city as being heaven, or being people who work towards heaven, and the earthly city, people who work towards earth, who work towards man's needs here on earth. Again, it exists alongside the city of God. They're not separate. The goal, it's separate from it in the composition and its goals. All men live in the earthly city. Only a few men live in the heavenly city. And only those really pious people. And true happiness, and Augustine argues that true, real, lasting happiness exists only for those who are citizens in the city of God, who serve God, and etc. Just like Plato said that the tyrannical soul, the person like Callicles who pursues worldly things, is never happy. Even though he realizes all these passions, he's never fully happy. But someone like Plato, who tries to seek greater truths and controls himself, he's happy. He's legitimately happy. is here. Just the person who pursues, who lives in the earthly city and pursues his own interests or pursues the interests of man, the hedonistic, pleasureful, interests. Even though those might be nice things like peace and justice, he can never be truly happy. The only truly happy person is the person who serves God, the person who lives in the city of God. So I'm going over this a lot and kind of repeating myself, just in the hopes that you can kind of say, because this is a difficult doctrine to get across. But it has a lot of important implications for medieval political thought. So, does everyone have this? All right. Now, again, like I said, Augustine believed that true happiness and virtue was available only in the city of God, just as Plato believed that man could only realize virtue in reason and intelligence, not in political pursuits. So, again, just like I said, that the person who is never satisfied, who pursues his passions, is never happy. The person who pursues the right things, whether for Plato being reason, the truth, knowledge, or for Augustine being God and the fulfillment of religious pursuits, that person is happy. Now, though Augustine argues that these two communities of men are sort of intermingled, he says that the best way for justice and happiness to reign is for the resident of the city of God to rule the city of man. So again, if you're a ruler or a king or a prince or anything like that, you should use Christian wisdom. You should use the eternal law to govern your realm. And part of Augustine's book, The City of God, reflects what we call a mirror for Christian princes. Remember, Machiavelli is writing a mirror for princes to rule, how to rule the best. Well, part of Augustine's book is basically a guide to rule according to Christian principles. So he sees a possibility for us to realize sort of true happiness on earth, as long as the ruler is endowed with Christian wisdom and he pursues it and he remembers to sort of subordinate himself to the city of God. The city of man can be pretty good. Now, unfortunately, most people don't do that, or most rulers didn't do that, and they didn't see Christian wisdom or Christian teaching as coinciding with what was politically correct or politically good. So again, as Augustine says, Christian laws can help improve people as long as they reflect the eternal laws. Should be pretty good, help improve people's character, keep people moral, etc. Sounds a lot like Plato in that regard. Okay. But this kind of caveat at the end here, even though we can make temporal laws or earthly laws, obey the eternal law, really what the deal is that true perfection can only really be achieved in the afterlife. So take it for what it's worth. It's not. I think that's like Plato, because Plato never really takes seriously this idea that we're going to achieve perfect justice or perfect virtue in a city, and neither does Augustine really, because after all we've seen that after the fall from Eden, mankind severed from God, he can't, without God's help, get back to that or to the state beforehand, where he was governed, where he was perfectly good. That takes an act of God. So we'll discuss that in a bit, actually. So, did everyone have that last slide? Okay. All right. So this was a good segue into kind of medieval political thought in general. In medieval times, the church was a major temporal or major earthly authority as well as a spiritual authority. Now remember, Augustine didn't necessarily say that the city of God was represented by the church, but a lot of people interpreted that way. Political considerations were almost always subject to spiritual or churchly views. So the church in Rome was able to exercise a great deal of power throughout the Middle Ages on the actions of governments and kings. And I have a few examples how these sort of Christian ideals suit here. If you think of the ideals of chivalry, now the ruling class in Europe at this time, in Western Europe, was
the knights, people who were gentlemen, and the church helped to formulate, it kind of adopted a lot of sort of pagan principles and ways that warlords previously had conducted themselves with church ideas to create this idea of chivalry. And this was supposed to temper the fighting spirit of the knights, who were supposed to be very violent people and govern, and fight heroically and all that, but it tempered that with some sort of Christian virtue. And the church actually succeeded in getting the knights to agree not to fight battles on holy days, etc. They would often, they tried originally to get it so Christian princes wouldn't fight each other, but that kind of fell through. Didn't do a very good job. And the idea is that the knight is supposed to be courteous, and he's supposed to protect women and children and peasants. Wasn't really borne out that way, but you can see how the church had an influence on how leaders were supposed to behave. So you have your powers of interdict and excommunication. Interdict and excommunication were invoked by the Pope. Excommunication means you were expelled from the church and you couldn't take the sacraments. And as a Catholic, if you can't take the sacraments, then you're unable to achieve the grace of God, and you're going to be doomed to hell. Now, interdict was when the Pope would designate an entire area and say, you're governed by a prince who's acting badly, so we're going to cast an interdict, and no one in this area can receive the sacraments, so you're all going to hell. So you better tell your prince to get in line. So in that way, also the church could exercise power. And they would say, hey, this is we're trying to better the church, we're trying to better the city of God, so we can enforce our rule and coerce the city of man, the earthly city. After all, the city of God is where it's at, and the church is the main representative. Now, they probably wouldn't have used Augustine like this, but you can see where this is going, or where this comes from. The idea of the divine right to rule is important there. I think we all know that is, a monarch says his justification for being allowed to rule is that he's chosen by God. And we have here Dante's Justification of Monarchy, which is actually on the next page, which I think will be interesting to you. But how the church also is able to govern in temporal matters is represented by, they controlled the path to heaven, the church did. And so it could demand money, it could ask for lands, it could ask for, you could be the most evil person on earth, but then if you left a big fortune to the church, the Pope could absolve you of all your sins. For example, in the 100 Years' War, there were these groups called the companies. They were free companies, and they would go around. They were men-at-arms and led by kind of renegade knights, and they would go around and invade towns and slaughter all the peasants and steal all the valuables and burn down monasteries and everything like that, all the fun stuff. And finally, one very famous one, it was led by a guy named John Blackwood, one very famous one, basically got the Pope to give them a bribe to quit doing what they were doing. And he said, okay, Pope, give us absolution for all the sins we've committed, and we'll stop terrorizing Italy and France and all this. So they all got absolution, even though they'd killed thousands of people, etc. So you can see how this sort of this relationship, which became based on what the church wanted or what church interests there were. So again, but one can interpret this in light of the city of God and the city of man. I'm not necessarily doing that. I just want to show you kind of how, or explain to you kind of how things went back then. Okay, this is Dante's justification. You don't write this down, please. Dante's justification of the monarchical system, or why monarchy is ascendant. It's kind of hard to read through, but Dante, of course, is the Italian poet of the 1300s who wrote the Divine Comedy, Inferno, etc. Very, very fun. If you haven't read the Inferno, I encourage you to read it. Good late night reading. Actually not, but let's see. Where am I? Okay. And Dante writes, mankind is a whole with relation to certain parts, and is a part with relation to a certain whole. It is a whole, of course, with relation to particular kingdoms and nations, as was shown above. and is a part with relation to the whole universe, as is self-evident. Now, I still don't know what he's saying there, but hey. Therefore, in the manner in which the constituent parts of humanity correspond to humanity as a whole, through the only principle of submission to a single prince, can be easily gathered from what has gone before. And therefore, humanity corresponds to the universe itself, or to its prince who is God, simply through one only principle, namely the submission to a single prince. We conclude from this that monarchy is necessary to the world for its well-being. Now, summarized, because there is a single God in heaven that governs the universe, kingdom should reflect that, so there should be a king on earth which governs his little universe. So monarchy is necessary to the world for its well-being. Because God is the monarch of the universe, every group of people, the parts of the universe, should have a monarch. So now, that's kind of an odd justification for a system of government. I don't know that carries much water with us today, but hey, that's kind of just an example of how they would use reason. Dante's using reason here, and also using Christian doctrine and Catholic cosmology here to justify the system of monarchy. Whereas we don't care for monarchy much, he did. So hopefully that kind of explains itself to you. Okay. Yeah. Not sure why I put him in there. Medieval Christian realism. Now, until now, we've talked about idealism and the substitution of Plato's reason for faith and the absolute truths of reason with Christian doctrine. Now, a lot of people interpret this early Christian thought not to be idealistic at all, but to be, in fact, realistic, especially in terms of human nature. So you say many interpret Christian political thought as being more realistic. After all, since the fall from Eden, mankind is a flawed and base creature. After the fall, beforehand we were pretty good. We were created in God's image. But after we fell from grace, after Adam's original sin, we're dirt. I mean, I have an example in here I think you'll enjoy. But thinkers of this time, especially in the church, who wanted to encourage the power of the church, told people, this life doesn't matter. This life is horrible, it's short, it's full of suffering. And it's because mankind is a horrible creature. Human beings are horrible creatures. They have defied God through original sin. They're always going to be sinful, etc. See, those who defy this fallen human nature, the saints, there aren't very many saints. If all men were saints and angels, governments probably wouldn't be necessary. We could all get along, but unlike that, but there really aren't any any systems like that I know of. So whereas, Plato and the idealists would say, or would try to have, would try to improve people's character, when you substitute faith as the method to improve people's character, people would say, well, there's no sense in doing it because human beings are imperfect, they're flawed, and there's no way to get them perfect except to be in heaven, which can't happen on this world. So, does everyone have this written down?
Not yet.
And again, this comes out of a period of time when Western Europe was in upheaval. There were barbarian invasions, and then warlords who assumed control of kingdoms like the Franks and the Germanic kingdoms, etc. And again, very violent period of history. Okay. Christian realism in human nature. Because life, especially for the common man in medieval Europe, was hard and very brutal. People lived very difficult, short lives. They hardly ever bathed. They lived with their farm animals. They're in constant danger of being killed by wars and plagues, etc. And so in this, when you think of how just horrible human life was in this sense, there was really no point to having any sort of faith that humanity could improve itself. When you go walk through a village of peasants and they're living with their pigs and not bathing in 3 years, and and they're dying, and infant mortality rate is extremely high. Women were very, they would die in childbirth almost as often as not. So again, especially in medieval Europe. And this is the Dance Macabre. It's a series of wood etchings. And basically, this is a common motif during this time, because it says that no matter how you are, and you see this person probably had the nice robes on or fine clothes, no matter who you are, no matter what you are, if you're the Pope in Rome or the poorest peasant in France, you're all going to die. You're all going to turn into a skeleton. You're all going to go to hell. Why concentrate? Or not go to hell. You're going to have to face. You're going to have to face the afterlife in some form. So concentrate on the next life. Get through this short, horrible life that you have. Concentrate on the next one. Live for the church. Augustine was a little more optimistic when he said, he's concentrating on the city of God. The city of man is breaking down, the Roman Empire is crumbling, our institutions are failing. Look toward the city of God as your salvation. This is kind of the same thing, but it's a little worse. I think we have time here. Oh, I forget that. Let's see. For a realistic depiction of medieval life here, we can see that's as loud as I can get it. He's saying, "Bring out your dead." I've never tried blowing up YouTube to this size, so I don't know what this is like. And this is what the Christian realists would have seen every day. So you tell me if you this is your only frame of reference for humanity. I remember the scene dragging on. So again, the medieval definition of a king, the only person who doesn't have shit all over him. So again, that's just a nice little diversion here. Not quite done. I've got 1 or 2 more slides. Oh. Hey, I showed you guys a movie. That's better than not really. Okay. So again, hopefully that indicates why people wouldn't have very high opinion of humanity. Okay. Here's a good example of Christian realism. This was written by Pope Innocent III. It kind of explains how horrible humankind is, etc. Pope Innocent III, probably the most powerful pope of his age. He wrote on the misery of the human condition. Nice sounding book. He was conceived from the itch of the flesh, in the heat of passion, and the stench of lust, and worse yet, with the stain of sin. Let's see. He was born to toil, dread, and trouble, and more wretched still, was born only to die. Man commits depraved acts by which he offends his neighbor and himself, shameful acts by which he defiles his name, his person, and his conscience,
and vain acts by which he ignores all things important, useful, and necessary. He will become fuel for those fires which are forever hot and burn forever bright, food for the worm which forever nibbles and digests, a mass of rottenness which will forever reek. So this is a very extreme version of how horrible humanity is and how horrible human people are. This wasn't the most common thought throughout the medieval period, but you can see again there's this idea, like Callicles says, people are all base and awful and terrible, or they're going to be governed by their passions. We should play into that. Okay. Now this is I think the last slide. How can governments and just laws improve the character of such a debased creature? Probably not. It's important to note that though we call this Christian realism, it is distinctly different from the realism you're going to get from Machiavelli. Machiavelli's realism is concerned with this life. It's optimistic. He says we can change human behavior, we can make governments more stable and peaceful, we can make happier lives for people, so long as the prince is willing to abandon the stupid, impractical, ideal prescriptions on behavior that Plato and Augustine and others had. Christian realism is very little hope. Basically, there's no hope for life. Like I said, Christian realism says life is forever doomed. We cannot improve man. We're all going to die. It's probably going to hurt, and you're probably going to hell. So, on that nice note, you can kind of contrast how that's different from Machiavelli. Machiavelli is someone who kind of throws away these ideas of religion. Now again, I'd say Augustine's more optimistic nature is far more ascendant during this period as doctrine. But I thought this kind of exercise would be a little fun to include in here. So that's all I have. You get your test back on Tuesday. Thanks for being patient.